So in this video, we're going to show how you can create a UX component with a list control and then populate the list control with data that is returned by a GraphQL query that is executed directly from the browser. So you can see here we have a GraphQL service called Northwind, and we're going to publish that service to the live preview folder by just going here and saying test with GraphQL and then live. So now we've basically published our GraphQL service to the live preview folder. And let's go now to our component. And you can see here we have a component. Here's our list control over here. And we're going to basically press this button now to execute this query against the service and populate the list. So when we click the button, you can see here that the list gets populated, and there's the data that was returned by the query. So you can see that the data comes back. It's a string that has a data property, and then inside the data property there's a get many records property, and then in get many records there's a records property. So let's go now and look at the code that was executed when the user presses this execute GraphQL query button. So we're going to call a JavaScript function called doQuery. And if we go to our JavaScript function, we can see here is the URL of the service that we are running. So recall that we published the service to the live preview folder by testing it in live preview. So this is the URL where our service is located. This is the query string that we're going to execute, and you can see how we're using the ES6 notation of a backtick to define a string that has line breaks in it. So that's our query string. Here is our OK function, and here is our fail function. So these are the callback functions, but we're not going to use these callback functions because we're going to use the promise version of the GraphQL query method, which is a method in the UX component JavaScript library. So there are two methods. There's GraphQL query, which takes a callback function. So you can see there would be the syntax if we use that GraphQL query. But if we call GraphQL query promise, then we don't pass in callback functions. Instead, we use the then method, and the then method takes a function that gets the data that is returned by the query. So you can see here we're basically executing a query that is going to get customer ID, contact name, company name, city, and country. So over here we basically in the promise, when the promise gets resolved, we basically pass the data. So now we have this object J, and then we extract the actual records that we want to use to populate the list by looking at j.data.getManyCustomers.records. We get a pointer to the list control, and then we populate the list. So let's go through this one more time here. So we go here and click the button that executes the query against the service. Now the service, in this case the service is local, but it could just as easily be a remote service. This is the data that gets returned by the service. We then use the JSON parse method to parse this data and extract the array of records, which we then use to populate the list control. Thanks very much for watching.